Several centuries after the biblical account of the Great Flood, the enigmatic giants known as Nephilim have reappeared. How is this possible if it was assumed that they had perished in the flood? Let us find out. Since there are verses in the Bible that indicate that the Nephilim returned after the flood in various ancient sources, such as the Book of Enoch and apocryphal texts, peculiarities about the Nephilim are mentioned. But is anything similar found in the Bible itself? The answer is affirmative, and to prove it, I refer to two biblical passages in Genesis 6:4 at the beginning of the flood narrative. It is mentioned that the Nephilim inhabited the earth both before and after the flood, but there is still more. More than 500 years later, these beings reappear after the flood, the Israelites, who had been enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years, upon obtaining their freedom, returned to their old home, a place known as Canaan, the promised land. No obstant, they encountered a terrifying presence. Numbers 13:33 relates, "There we saw the Nephilim, descendants of Anak, originating from the Nephilim. And in comparison we looked like grasshoppers, both in our own eyes and in theirs." Thus, it is confirmed that the giants, the mysterious Nephilim, are mentioned in the Bible. But how is this possible? This poses a dilemma, since it has traditionally been taught that the Nephilim were exterminated with the flood sent by God. Is there then a contradiction in the scriptures? Was the flood sent by God in vain? Let us examine possible answers. There are at least three interpretations proposed by biblical scholars to resolve this question, and one of them could radically alter our perception of the history of the flood. Although this would not necessarily be negative, below, I will expose three distinct theories. The first theory, which is quite peculiar, originates from a text that was not included in the Bible, known as the Genesis Apocryphon. In this, Noah's father reflects on whether his wife's pregnancy was the result of the Watchers and the Holy Ones, or of the Nephilim, and this caused him worry for the child. What does this imply? It would be a dramatic argument par excellence. Maybe you are interested in sitting down to hear this. Noah's father suspected that his wife had had an affair with an angel, which made him think that Noah could be partially angelic, or in other words, semi-Nephilim. Although this hypothesis was formulated much later than the flood, in the 1st century before Christ, it is fascinating to many experts, although they consider it rather an alternative narrative to the traditional flood story. However, what is deduced here is that even the people of antiquity were aware of the return of the Nephilim after the flood, and like us, they tried to understand how it could have happened. The second hypothesis suggests an ambiguity in the language used in the flood account. According to Genesis 7:19, the waters flooded all the high mountains under heaven, which seems quite explicit. However, the scholar Michael Heiser argues that in other passages of the Bible, all does not necessarily imply totality and world does not necessarily refer to the entire planet. I'm going to explain what he means. An example of this we find in Genesis 41:57, where it is mentioned that all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to acquire grain. Heiser points out that not every individual in the world went to Egypt to buy grain. Although the verse seems to indicate it, if interpreted literally, it is possible that the Bible only wants to convey that a large amount of people were affected, but perhaps it does not refer to every human being on the planet. Therefore, the expression all the earth could allude to all the people mentioned in the Bible up to that moment, and in this sense, the word world would be interpreted rather as the environment of the individuals to whom the Bible has referred, that is, the human sphere composed of the tribes described in the Old Testament. It is possible that there were people in other regions, although it is not entirely clear, but some experts in biblical studies consider that there is some openness to interpret that the flood did not cover the totality of the planet, but only the part of the world of the people who appear in the biblical account. Some criticize this idea. Questioning whether God did not achieve his purpose, they argue that the flood was intended to eradicate all the Nephilim. And if this is true, it did not manage to destroy them all. It is a valid argument. But another question arises, was the purpose of the flood to exterminate each one of the Nephilim, or simply to put an end to their rebellion by eliminating the majority so that the survivors would no longer constitute a threat? If the divine intention was simply to protect humanity from the danger that the Nephilim represented and from the corruption that they generated, then the flood fulfilled its mission. The flood achieved its objective by dealing a hard blow to the Nephilim. A secondary hypothesis could be that, according to Noah and his family, the entire known world was flooded. Putting themselves in Noah's position, from his perspective on the ark, he probably saw water as far as his sight reached. So for him, everything was submerged, although perhaps in other distant regions it was not like that. The occupants of the ark would have no way of knowing, and now, the final theory, which arises from an unexpected biblical passage and which has confused many, relates to the veils that cover the head. Have you ever wondered why women had to cover their heads during biblical times? Paul alludes to this in 1 Corinthians 11:10, mentioning that for that reason, a woman must carry a sign of authority on her head. And now look at this. Because of the angels. How, because of the angels? What does this mean? This suggests another theory about the return of the Nephilim. and I wonder if you have grasped the idea. If not, there exists another indication about what Paul could have been hinting at in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is the Damascus document in 2:16-19, where it is told how many were led astray by certain ideas. Even robust and powerful men of past times stumbled because of them and continued to do so by following their impulses. The watchers of heaven, who are the angels, fell and were trapped by not following the commandments of God. Their descendants, the children of the angels as tall as cedars and with bodies as immense as mountains, also succumbed. Who does that make you think of? Undoubtedly, they are the Nephilim. It is another passage that talks about angels called watchers desiring women and fathering children with them. That is somewhat unusual. But how does it relate to veils on the head? We need to investigate further. In 1 Corinthians 11:15, Paul mentions that if a woman has long hair, it is a cause for pride for her, since it has been granted to her as a veil. Paul had previously indicated that women must cover their hair. Is that not true? But here he states that the hair is her veil. So how can hair be both her veil and something that needs to be veiled? What I'm going to explain below is somewhat complex. So first, I want to point out that this theory has been published in an academic journal of the Society of Biblical Literature and has been reviewed by experts in the field. According to the academic Troy Martin of Xavier University, the term used for covering could also be interpreted as an prepare yourself. What Paul really wanted to express was that, in antiquity, long hair was considered part of the reproductive system, an extension of that system. And this was precisely what was believed in that period. Perhaps you have already heard of this before without realizing it. Let me clarify by way of example. Have you ever heard that long hair represents fertility? Reflect for a moment on it. What would be the reason for long hair to symbolize fertility? It is possible that this idea comes from other cultures and myths. It is a more delicate way of expressing that in ancient times it was thought that long hair was an extension of the reproductive organs. In fact, we know that ancient civilizations had this perception of long hair. Based on the texts of these illustrious authors, Hippocrates, Tertullian, Aristotle, it was believed that if a woman let down her hair while bowing her head to pray, this would provoke desire in the angels. When Paul discussed the use of veils by women, according to this interpretation, he was referring to Genesis 6:1-4. Yes, that is the passage in which the first appearance of the Nephilim is narrated. When the angels chose human wives and joined them, giving rise to the giants, this suggests what is known as the repopulation theory, which maintains that the angels, specifically the fallen angels, returned to join with human women after the flood to father more Nephilim. Just as the Damascus document we analyzed insinuates by alluding to the fact that the angels impregnated more human women after the flood. Although the Bible does not explicitly confirm it, Paul preferred to prevent, and that is why he recommended that women cover their heads. So, to summarize, the hypotheses are the following. The first, that there was a Nephilim on the ark, although it seems to be the least likely. The second, that the flood was a local event, an interpretation that could be sustained by adjusting the words of the Bible a little, thus leaving a slight possibility open, and the third, that the angels generated more Nephilim after the flood. We do not have a definitive answer about the return of the Nephilim. The only thing certain, according to the Bible, is that in some way they returned, and this enigma has been a subject of debate since biblical times. Which of these explanations seems most convincing to you? I would like to know your opinion in the comments. If you are interested in delving into this topic, I highly recommend the books Supernatural, or its more extensive version, The Unseen Realm, both by Dr. Michael Heiser. You can find the links to purchase these books in the video description. You will be wondering, however, what happened to the Nephilim after their return? What did they do? Although it seems incredible, the narrative of the Nephilim leads to a direct confrontation with Jesus Christ. How? Yes. It is an aspect that many usually overlook, but subscribe if you wish to know more about the Nephilim, as we will be publishing more videos soon. Meanwhile, take a look at the channel's playlist. Here you have the link on screen, where you will find several very interesting videos about the Nephilim giants. See you soon. May God bless you.